Story 1. The Whispering Shelves. Mary Ann had always been drawn to the library's old wing. It was a place of silence and solitude, where the scent of aged paper and dust hung heavy in the air. As the head librarian, she had spent countless hours there, losing herself in the rows of forgotten books. One evening, as she was shelving a few last-minute returns, she noticed something strange. The air around her seemed to hum, a soft whispering sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She paused, listening, but the whispers faded into silence. Shaking off the unease, Mary Ann continued her work, but the whispering returned, growing louder with each step she took. It seemed to be coming from the shelves themselves, as if the books were alive, murmuring secrets to each other. Intrigued and unnerved, she followed the sound to a row of ancient tomes. One book in particular caught her eye, a thick leather-bound volume with no title. As she reached out to touch it, the whispering stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an eerie stillness. Mary Ann pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavy, its pages yellowed with age. When she opened it, she was startled to find the pages completely blank. No words, no illustrations, just empty, brittle paper. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She quickly returned the book to its place, but the unease lingered. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispering began again, louder this time. It was coming from the book, which she had inexplicably brought home with her. Terrified, Mary Ann returned to the library the next morning. She placed the book back on the shelf, hoping the whispers would stop. But as she turned to leave, she heard her name, whispered softly yet clearly. The sound sent chills through her. She never returned to the old wing after that day. The whispers never followed her again, but she knew the books were waiting for someone else to listen. Story 2. The Unreturned Book. Jonathan was a man of routine. Every Friday he visited the local library, returning one book and borrowing another. The librarian, an elderly woman with a kind smile, always had a recommendation for him. One day, she handed him a book with a strange, worn cover. "This one's special," she said with a wink. The title was The Unreturned, but there was no author listed. Intrigued, Jonathan took it home and began to read. The story was gripping, a tale of a man who finds a mysterious book that predicts the future. But as Jonathan read on, he began to feel uneasy. The events in the book started to mirror his own life, down to the smallest detail. The man in the story, like Jonathan, was a creature of habit, and like Jonathan, he borrowed a book that he was warned never to return. But the man in the story didn't listen. He returned the book, only to find his life unraveling in terrifying ways. As Jonathan reached the final chapter, he realized with a start that he had made a grave mistake. The librarian's words echoed in his mind. This one's special. The book wasn't just predicting his future. It was controlling it. The last page revealed the man's fate, a series of unfortunate events leading to his untimely death. Panic set in. Jonathan rushed to the library, but when he arrived, the building was deserted. The librarian was nowhere to be found, and the place had an air of abandonment. Frantically, he searched for the book, hoping to undo whatever curse he had unleashed. But the book was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. Jonathan was left standing in the empty library, his heart pounding, knowing that his fate was sealed. He had become the next character in the story, another name to add to the unreturned. Story 3. The Midnight Reader. Mrs. Eldridge had been the night librarian at the small-town library for over 20 years. She enjoyed the quiet and solitude, the company of books more comforting than that of people. The library closed at 8 p.m., but she often stayed late, tidying up and reading the books that never seemed to get checked out. One night, as the clock struck midnight, she noticed a man sitting at one of the tables near the back. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. She hadn't seen him come in, but she didn't recall locking the doors either. Curious, Mrs. Eldridge approached him. "Sir, we're closed," she said softly, but the man didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the book in front of him, a large, leather-bound volume she had never seen before. The air around them grew colder as she neared, and a sense of dread filled her. She reached out to touch the man's shoulder, but as her fingers grazed his coat, he vanished, along with the book. Mrs. Eldridge gasped, stumbling back in shock. The table was empty, as if the man had never been there. Shaken, she decided to leave for the night, but as she turned off the lights, she heard the faint rustling of pages. The sound was coming from the very table where the man had been sitting. With trembling hands, she switched the lights back on. The book was there, sitting in the exact spot where the man had been. Her heart raced as she picked it up. It was cold to the touch, the cover worn and ancient. The title, The Midnight Reader, was embossed in faded gold letters. Mrs. Eldridge opened the book, and her blood ran cold. The pages were filled with names. Names of all the people who had ever worked in the library, including hers. At the end of the list was a note. The reader must return. The next morning, the library staff found Mrs. Eldridge's lifeless body at the table, the book open in front of her. No one knew how she had died, but the book was gone, as if it had never existed. But the staff noticed one thing. The old-fashioned man still visited the library, but only at midnight. Story 4. The Forgotten Manuscript. When the renowned author William Barrow donated his private collection of manuscripts to the city library, the staff was thrilled. Among the stacks of old, yellowed pages and leather-bound tomes was a manuscript no one had ever heard of, simply titled The Forgotten. Curious Emma, a young librarian, decided to examine it. The manuscript was beautifully written, the ink still dark and sharp despite its age. As she read, she found herself entranced by the story. It was about a writer who, upon finishing his masterpiece, was haunted by his characters until he lost his mind. The deeper Emma delved into the manuscript, the more unsettling it became. The descriptions were so vivid that she could almost hear the voices of the characters, feel their presence in the room with her. By the time she reached the final chapter, she was deeply unnerved. The last page of the manuscript described a chilling scene. The writer, after finishing the story, looks up from his work to find his characters standing around him, their eyes full of malice. He tries to scream, but no sound comes out. The story ends abruptly with a single sentence. The writer was never seen again. Emma's hands trembled as she closed the manuscript. She suddenly felt a prickling on the back of her neck, as if she were being watched. She quickly put the manuscript back into its box and pushed it to the back of the archive. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the characters from the manuscript, their eyes cold and accusing. The story played over and over in her mind, refusing to let her rest. The next day, Emma decided to check on the manuscript, but when she opened the box, it was gone. Frantic, she searched the entire archive, but it was nowhere to be found. Weeks passed, and Emma's obsession with the manuscript grew. She couldn't escape the feeling that the characters were watching her, waiting for her to finish the story. One night, she sat down at her desk, opened a blank notebook, and began to write. When Emma didn't show up for work the next day, her colleagues assumed she was ill. But when days turned into weeks, they grew worried. Eventually, the police were called to her apartment, but she was gone, disappeared without a trace. On her desk, they found a single notebook, the pages filled with Emma's neat handwriting. The last entry read, "The librarian was never seen again." Story 5. The Cursed Encyclopedia. The library's collection of rare books was the pride of the town, but none was more infamous than the 18th century encyclopedia set known as the Encyclopedia Daemonica. Bound in dark, cracked leather, the volumes were said to contain knowledge of forbidden rituals and ancient curses. No one had opened the books in decades, until one stormy afternoon when a curious young researcher named David decided to take a look. He was a skeptic, more interested in debunking the myths than in uncovering any dark secrets. He pulled one of the dusty volumes from the shelf and began to read. The first few pages were innocuous enough, filled with mundane entries about long-forgotten topics. But as David turned the pages, he noticed the writing began to change. The letters twisted and distorted, forming words in a language he didn't recognize. As he read aloud, the room grew colder and the lights flickered. The shadows in the corners of the library seemed to stretch and grow, creeping toward him. The words on the page seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and David's breath caught in his throat. Suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening silence. The lights went out completely, plunging the library into darkness. David could feel the air thickening around him, pressing in on all sides. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't move. Out of the darkness he heard a voice, deep, guttural, and filled with malice. "You should not have read from the book," it hissed. The words sent a shiver down David's spine. Panic set in. He dropped the book and tried to run, but the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. The last thing he saw was the open encyclopedia on the floor, its pages glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. When the librarian found David the next morning, he was sitting at the table, staring blankly ahead. The book was closed in front of him, but his hands were still clutching the edges of the cover, his knuckles white. David never spoke of what happened that night, but he was never the same. The books were sealed away again, locked in a glass case in the deepest part of the archive, where no one would ever dare to read from them. Story 6. The Portrait in the Library. The old library had always been a place of refuge for Evelyn. She loved the peace and quiet, the smell of old books, and the comforting silence that filled the space. But one afternoon, as she browsed through the fiction section, she noticed something strange. A portrait hanging on the wall that she had never seen before. The portrait was of a young woman, her expression somber, her eyes deep and haunting. The painting was masterfully done, almost lifelike, but there was something unsettling about it that Evelyn couldn't quite place. Intrigued, she asked the librarian about the portrait. The librarian, a frail old man, frowned. "There's no portrait in the library, dear," he said, his voice shaky. Evelyn insisted, but the librarian simply shook his head. "It must be your imagination," he muttered before shuffling away. Determined to prove herself right, Evelyn returned to the spot where she had seen the portrait. But when she arrived, it was gone. She searched the entire library, but there was no trace of the painting. Frustrated, Evelyn decided to leave. But as she walked towards the exit, she felt a cold breeze brush against her skin. She turned, and there it was. The portrait hanging in a different spot, the woman's eyes fixed on her. Heart pounding, Evelyn approached the portrait. The closer she got, the more she felt as if the woman's eyes were following her every move. And then, as she stood right in front of it, the woman in the portrait smiled, a slow, sinister smile that sent chills down Evelyn's spine. She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The smile faded, and the woman's face returned to its somber expression. But the fear lingered, wrapping around Evelyn like a cold, suffocating blanket. Terrified, Evelyn fled the library. But the image of the woman's smile haunted her, appearing in her dreams and in every reflective surface she passed. No matter where she went, she felt the woman's eyes on her, watching, waiting. Evelyn never returned to the library. She couldn't bear the thought of seeing that portrait again. But deep down, she knew the woman in the painting was still there, waiting for the next curious soul to fall into her gaze. Story 7. The Librarian's Secret. Margaret had been the head librarian at the small-town library for as long as anyone could remember. She was known for her strict demeanor and her meticulous care of the books. But there was one rule she enforced above all others. No one was allowed in the library after dark. One night, a group of curious teenagers decided to find out why. They waited until Margaret left, then snuck into the library, using a stolen key one of them had swiped from her desk. The library was eerily silent, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. As they wandered through the rows of books, they noticed something strange. There were no shadows. The light from their flashlights illuminated the space, but it cast no shadows on the floor or the walls. Nervous but excited, they pressed on. When they reached the back of the library, they found a door they had never noticed before. It was heavy and made of dark wood, with an intricate, ancient-looking lock. One of the boys, James, tried the key, and to their surprise, it fit. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Against their better judgment, they descended. The air grew colder and more oppressive with each step. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a large stone pedestal, and on it lay an ancient book. The book was massive, bound in what looked like human skin. The title, The Librarian's Secret, was etched into the cover in letters that seemed to writhe and shift as they watched. Before they could stop him, James reached out and opened the book. As he did, a low, guttural whisper filled the room. The pages were blank, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were deafening. Panicked, the teenagers tried to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The room grew colder, the whispers louder, until they felt like they were being suffocated by the sound. Suddenly, the door burst open, and there stood Margaret, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed. With a wave of her hand, the book snapped shut, and the whispers ceased. The teenagers fled, but they could never escape the feeling of cold eyes watching them, the echoes of the whispers that haunted their dreams. And Margaret, she returned to her post, the guardian of the library's dark secret, waiting for the next foolish soul to break the rules. Story 9. The Binding Ritual. In the heart of the city's grand library, hidden in a dusty corner, lay a bookbinding room that few knew existed. It was a place of ancient tools and forgotten crafts where leather and thread merged to create the perfect book. But there was one bookbinder who knew the room's true purpose, a man named Edgar. Edgar had been the library's bookbinder for as long as anyone could remember. He was a quiet man, always seen with ink-stained fingers and a distant look in his eyes. Rumors whispered among the staff that Edgar's skills went beyond mere craftsmanship. Some said he had discovered a way to bind not just books, but souls. He was a quiet man, always seen with ink-stained fingers and a distant look in his eyes. Rumors whispered among the staff that Edgar's skills went beyond mere craftsmanship. Some said he had discovered a way to bind not just books, but souls. One cold evening, Edgar received a strange package. It was a book, old and tattered, with a note attached. "Rebind me." The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper yellowed with age. The book's cover was falling apart, its pages barely held together by fraying threads. Edgar felt an odd compulsion as he unwrapped the book. He sensed something dark and powerful within its pages. Ignoring the unease gnawing at him, he began his work. As he stripped away the old cover and removed the stitching, Edgar noticed something strange. The pages were filled with names, hundreds of them, written in a looping, elegant script. But there was something else. Faint, almost invisible, were small stains, as if tears or drops of blood had marked the pages. Ignoring the growing sense of dread, Edgar continued his work. He chose the finest leather, dyed a deep crimson, and carefully bound the book anew. But as he stitched the final thread, something happened. The room grew cold and the air thickened with a palpable tension. Suddenly, Edgar's hands froze. He felt a searing pain in his chest, as if invisible threads were binding him from the inside out. He tried to pull away, but his fingers wouldn't obey. The thread in his hand began to move on its own, stitching through the air, pulling him closer to the book. Panicking, Edgar realized the truth. The book was binding him, his soul being stitched into its pages. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The last thing he saw was his name, written in blood, red ink on the first page, before his vision went dark. The next morning, the library staff found the book lying on the workbench, its new binding flawless and beautiful. but Edgar was gone, leaving behind only a single red thread on the floor. From that day on, the bookbinding room was sealed, and the crimson-bound book was placed on a high shelf, out of reach. But those who dared to touch it swore they could feel a heartbeat within the cover. A reminder that Edgar was still bound within the cover, a reminder that Edgar was still bound within forever part of his own creation. Story 10. The Ghost in the Catalogue. The city's central library was known for its vast collection and its state of the art digital catalogue system. But there was one librarian, Mrs. Havers, who preferred the old card catalogue, a massive, creaking wooden cabinet filled with thousands of index cards, each meticulously handwritten. One day, a young librarian named Clara was assigned to help Mrs. Havers organize the card catalogue. As she began her work, she noticed something odd. Some of the cards were marked with tiny, barely visible symbols, circles, crosses, and other strange shapes. Clara asked Mrs. Havers about the symbols, but the old librarian dismissed her questions with a wave of her hand. "They're just old notations," she said, her voice curt, but Clara wasn't convinced. Late that evening, long after Mrs. Havers had gone home, Claire decided to investigate further. She stayed behind, sorting through the cards in the dim light of the library's old reading lamps. As she worked, she began to notice a pattern in the symbols, as if they were guiding her toward something. Finally, she found it, a card with a strange, spiraling symbol. The card was for a book titled The Lost Soul, but the location listed on the card didn't correspond to any shelf in the library. Intrigued, Clara followed the directions, which led her deep into the library's basement, a place few dared to go. The basement was cold and musty, filled with stacks of old, forgotten books. Clara searched for the book, but it was nowhere to be found. Frustrated, she turned to leave, but then she heard it. A faint whisper, like the rustling of pages. She followed the sound to a dark corner of the basement, where a single book lay on the floor. It was covered in dust, its spine cracked with age. The title, The Lost Soul, was barely legible. As Clara picked up the book, the whispering grew louder, more urgent. She opened the cover, and the whispering stopped abruptly. The pages were blank save for the first one, which bore a single name, hers. Terrified, Clara dropped the book and fled the basement. But the whispering followed her, growing louder with each step. When she reached the main floor, Mrs. Havers was waiting for her, a knowing look in her eyes. "You shouldn't have gone down there," Mrs. Havers said, her voice cold. "The catalogue is more than just a record of books. It's a record of souls, souls like yours." Clara tried to speak, but the whispering drowned out her words. The last thing she saw was Mrs. Havers closing the card catalogue, sealing her fate within its drawers. The next morning, the library staff found the card for the lost soul back in its place, but Claire was gone. Mrs. Havers simply shook her head when asked about the young librarian, her expression unreadable. The card catalogue remained, a silent witness to the many souls it had claimed, and Mrs. Havers continued her work, knowing that the library always needed new stories to fill its pages. Story 11. The Last Reader. In a remote town nestled deep in the mountains, there was a library that was said to hold every book ever written. The library was old, its walls lined with shelves that stretched up into the darkness. The townspeople rarely visited, for they believed the library was cursed. It was said that whoever entered the library would never leave, their soul bound to the books forever. But the town's new resident, a young man named Peter, didn't believe in such superstitions. A lover of books, he was eager to explore the library's vast collection. One crisp autumn evening, Peter made his way to the library. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the smell of dust and old paper filling his nostrils. Inside, the library was silent, the only sound, the soft rustling of pages. As Peter wandered through the rows of books, he noticed that the shelves seemed to go on forever, the aisles twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. No matter how far he walked, he couldn't find the exit. Determined to find his way out, Peter began to search for a book that might help. But as he pulled one book after another from the shelves, he realized with growing horror that each book contained a story about him. The titles were all different, but the content was always the same. A young man lost in a library, never to return. Panic set in as Peter realized he was trapped in a nightmare. The library wasn't just a building. It was a living entity, feeding on the souls of those who entered. The books were its victims, their stories written and rewritten for eternity. Desperate, Peter tried to destroy the books, but they were indestructible, their pages regenerating the moment they were torn. Exhausted and defeated, he slumped to the floor, surrounded by the books that held his fate. As the hours passed, Peter's mind began to slip. The lines between reality and fiction blurred, and he could no longer tell if he was a man trapped in a library or a character in a book. The last thing he remembered was the feeling of the pages turning on their own, writing the final chapter of his life. When the townspeople noticed that Peter had gone missing, they simply shook their heads. Another victim of the cursed library, they said. No one dared to search for him, for they knew that once the library had claimed you, there was no escape. Story 12. The Book of Shadows. The ancient book was the crown jewel of the library's occult section. Bound in dark leather and inscribed with strange symbols, the Book of Shadows was said to contain powerful and dangerous knowledge. The librarian, Mr. Reed, kept it locked in a glass case, warning all who asked about it to stay away. But when a mysterious visitor arrived one stormy night, everything changed. The man, tall and cloaked in black, had eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. He asked to see the book, and despite his better judgment, Mr. Reed found himself unable to refuse. The man examined the book with a knowing smile, his fingers tracing the symbols on the cover. "This book holds the power to change fate," he murmured, more to himself than to Mr. Reed, "but it requires a willing sacrifice." As the man left, he handed Mr. Reed a small, intricately carved key. "The choice is yours," he said before disappearing into the night. For days, Mr. Reed tried to forget the encounter, but the key burned in his pocket, a constant reminder of the book's potential. Finally, curiosity got the better of him, and he unlocked the case. As he opened the book, a rush of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing the lights. The pages glowed faintly in the darkness, and Mr. Reed felt an overwhelming compulsion to read. The words seemed to leap off the page, searing themselves into his mind. But the knowledge came at a price. As he read, he felt his life force draining away, his body growing weaker with each passing second. The book demanded a sacrifice, and it was taking it from him. Terrified, Mr. Reed tried to close the book, but his hands wouldn't obey. The shadows in the room seemed to grow, closing in around him, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. With his last ounce of strength, Mr. Reed threw the book across the room. It landed with a heavy thud, the glow fading from its pages. The shadows receded, and the lights flickered back on, but Mr. Reed was left a shell of his former self. His hair turned white, his eyes hollow and haunted. The book was locked away again, but the library was never the same. The shadows lingered, waiting for the next curious soul to open the Book of Shadows and pay the ultimate price. Story 13. The Haunting of the Archive. The city's library had a dark history, one that was buried deep within its archives. The basement was a labyrinth of old documents, newspapers, and forgotten records, a place where few dared to venture. But it was also home to something far more sinister. Maya, a new hire at the library, was assigned to organize the archives. She spent long hours in the basement, sorting through dusty files and brittle papers. The work was tedious, but she enjoyed the solitude. One evening, as she was working late, she heard a faint tapping sound. At first, she thought it was just the old building settling, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, a place she hadn't yet explored. Curiosity piqued, Maya followed the sound. She found a set of old filing cabinets, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust. The tapping was coming from one of the drawers, as if something inside was trying to get out. Heart pounding, Maya hesitated, but the tapping continued, almost pleading. She reached out and slowly opened the drawer. Inside was a single yellowed file labeled Missing Persons. The file was thick, filled with reports spanning decades. As she flipped through the pages, Maya felt a growing sense of dread. The names and faces were familiar, too familiar. They were people she had seen in the library, staff members who had suddenly quit, patrons who had stopped coming. The tapping stopped as soon as she opened the file, replaced by a heavy silence. But then, as she turned the last page, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her own name listed among the missing. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. The shadows in the room seemed to move, closing in around her. The tapping resumed, louder than before, coming from all directions. Maya dropped the file and ran, but the basement seemed to stretch on forever, the stairs always just out of reach. The shadows followed, growing darker and more oppressive, until she could barely breathe. The next morning, the library staff found the basement empty, the filing cabinet drawer open, the missing persons file lying on the floor. Maya was never seen again, her name added to the long list of those who had disappeared within the library's haunted archive. Story 14. The Library of Forgotten Memories. Tucked away in the quietest corner of the city was a small, unassuming library, known as the Library of Forgotten Memories. Few people knew of its existence, and even fewer had ever visited, but those who did spoke of strange experiences, of memories they hadn't lived and lives they couldn't remember. It was said that the library held not just books, but memories that had been forgotten, lost, or erased. A librarian, a mysterious old woman named Agatha, claimed that the library was a refuge for the forgotten, a place where lost memories could find a home. One day, a man named Thomas stumbled upon the library by accident. He was a writer struggling with a severe case of writer's block, desperate for inspiration. Agatha welcomed him warmly, inviting him to browse the collection. As Thomas wandered through the rows of books, he felt an odd sense of familiarity, as if he had been there before. The books were all untitled, their covers blank, but when he pulled one from the shelf and opened it, he was shocked to find his own memories written on the pages, memories he had long forgotten, buried deep in his subconscious. Intrigued, Thomas continued to explore the library, each book revealing more of his past, but the memories weren't all pleasant. Some were dark, painful experiences he had tried to forget. As he delved deeper, he began to question his own life, wondering if his memories were real or just stories written in the library's books. Late into the night, Thomas found a book that was different from the others. Its cover was black, its pages filled with blank spaces, as if the memories had been erased. But as he held the book, he felt a strange sensation, as if something was being pulled from his mind. He tried to put the book down, but it was too late. The blank spaces began to fill, the ink forming words and images, memories that were being taken from him. Panicked, Thomas tried to leave, but the library seemed to stretch on endlessly, the exit always just out of reach. Agatha appeared beside him, her expression sorrowful. "This is the price of remembering," she said softly. "The library must take something in return." Thomas's vision blurred as the last of his memories were drained from him, leaving him an empty shell. The next day, the library was gone, leaving no trace behind. Thomas was found wandering the streets, unable to remember who he was or where he came from, just another forgotten soul, lost to the Library of Forgotten Memories. Story 15. The Night Librarian. Every small town has its local legends, and in the town of Brooksville, the legend of the Night Librarian was well known. It was said that after the library closed for the day, a mysterious figure would appear to tend to the books, arranging and rearranging them with meticulous care. No one had ever seen the Night Librarian, but everyone knew the rules. Never stay in the library after dark. Alice, a college student home for the summer, had always been skeptical of the story. She had heard it from her grandmother, who had been a librarian herself. To Alice, it was just a silly superstition, something to scare the children. One evening, as she was studying for her exams, Alice lost track of time. By the time she looked up from her books, the library was empty, the lights dimmed. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Curious to see if there was any truth to the legend, Alice decided to stay a little longer. She hid behind a tall bookshelf, waiting for the night librarian to appear. The minutes ticked by, and just as she was about to leave, she heard it. A soft shuffling sound, like the rustle of fabric. Peering around the edge of the shelf, Alice saw a figure moving through the library. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark robes that seemed to blend into the shadows. The face was hidden beneath a hood, and in its hand it held a long, thin staff. The night librarian moved with an eerie grace, its movements precise and deliberate. It reached out to touch the books, and as it did, the books seemed to glow faintly, as if coming to life under its touch. Fascinated and terrified, Alice watched as the figure made its way through the library. But then, the night librarian stopped, turning its head as if it had sensed her presence. Slowly, it began to move toward her, its staff tapping softly against the floor. Alice's heart raced as she tried to back away, but her foot caught on a loose floorboard, sending her crashing to the ground. The night librarian loomed over her, its face still hidden, but she could feel its cold, piercing gaze. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "This place is not for the living." With that, the night librarian raised its staff, and the world around Alice went dark. The next morning, the library staff found Alice's belongings scattered on the floor, but she was nowhere to be found. The old grandfather clock had stopped, its hands frozen at the exact moment Alice had encountered the night librarian. To this day, the legend of the night librarian continues, and the townspeople still warn their children, never stay in the library after dark.